Okay, moving on. I don't have any text behind me. Not that you're ever even able to read the text. I don't know. But no text behind me because I'm not talking about a specific poem this time. I just want to talk about sort of some of the themes that are coming up in this batch of poems that you've gotten, even across all three of these packets, at least the first two packets. And that's how the self encounters and identifies with the other, okay? And if you think about if you go on in literature, you've studied literature, that's something that you'll hear a lot. You have the self and you have the other, right? It could be another person, it could be some sort of like spiritual or mystical thing, it could be an obstacle, but there's the self and the other. So we seem to always have like these two things, right? One thing in opposition to another. And that's the real question. How does the self encounter the other? What are the others in some of these poems, and what is the relationship between the self and the other? We read Donald Hall. The other is sort of, he's always talking about death, right? What is Donald Hall's relationship with death? Does he fear it? Does he not? One of the questions I've got up for you this week in the discussion thread has to do with the poem Oxcart Man. This poem I've given to Comp 1 classes in the past. And they read it, and I always find people coming out on two sides of the debate. Some people think it's entirely depressing, like, oh my God, this guy, he grows all this stuff, he builds the car, he walks, sells it all, and he's not going to go to the casino or whatever. I mean, there were no casinos probably, but he's not going to go blow all the money on something that he wants or needs. He's just going to go back and do it all again, right? And it's sort of hopeless. So some people think it's pessimistic, it's hopeless, it's depressing. Some people find it very uplifting. And I don't know, that's something, and that's a specific poem, so you can think about that when you get into the discussion thread. But across all of the poems, how does Donald Hall deal with death? When we're talking about when you grow things, before you can sell your vegetables, you got to kill them, right? You got to pull them out of the ground and kill them. So that's one kind of death. How does he deal with his own mortality? We saw that in Maple Syrup. We saw it in Kicking the Leaves. He deals a lot with generations, right? There's been lots of grandfather, grandmother, father, me, the self, and the future generations, daughter, son, those sorts of things. And so, he does not have probably the typical reaction to death. He seems to embrace it, right? I actually think that Donald Hall is in some ways similar to Whitman, because Whitman sort of celebrates everything. He says, if you, at the very end of Song of Myself, section 53 or 54, or is it 52 sections, so 51, I can't remember. Like the final two sections of Song of Myself, if you look for me, look for me underneath your boot sole, I'll be in a blade of grass, right? Sort of referencing this idea that we're all going to die, we're all going to decay, but we're all going to be part of the matter that comes up after that, right? We're all going to be part of the life that comes after that. So I think that's part of the attitude that Donald Hall has. So he addresses the other. In some of his poems, the other is death, and he's not really afraid of death, right? Death is not personified in any way, but it's kind of the other. It's the spiritual, mystical sort of thing that he has to encounter. And he sort of embraces it, right? He at least doesn't shy away from it. He doesn't demonize it or anything. He understands that it's part of the process, which I would like. I just turned 30. I wish I could say that I have such a mature outlook on things, but I don't, at least not right now. And actually, it's funny because our son is due like any day now. And the first poem I gave you in the Donald Hall packet is My Son, My Executioner, which is on the occasion of the birth of one of his children and how it makes him realize his own mortality. But death is one of these others, right? And so it's a question of how we confront that. James Wright is full of others, right? We have the self and we have the other. And in James Wright, the other a lot of times is another human, okay? I gave you St. Judas, and St. Judas is talking about, first, that poem is told from the point of view of Judas, right? And its title is sort of empathizing with the character, okay? So, like I said in the other video, a lot of Christian followers are probably not going to think that Judas should be referred to as a saint, but he's empathizing with this guy. And in the poem, Judas is actually empathizing with this man who's being beaten up, right? So we have if you want to talk about whether you consider the Bible literature or anything, in all of literature, we have one of the biggest villains ever in Judas, and he is empathizing with this man who's been beaten, okay? And he's trying to go and help him. Same thing sort of happens with At the Executed Murderer's Grave. There's this sort of empathy for this guy. Yes, he's a murderer, but he's also human. And so there's this kind of reaching across and this encounter with the other. The other is another human. What other poems did I give you? Those two, St. Judas. We have a blessing, okay? When he encounters the horses are the other. And at the end it says, Suddenly I realized if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom. And so he encounters these horses. And, James Wright is like, when I was in college, I did an independent study, which is like, male poetry or poetry in the male experience or something. Because, I love reading these poems by men. And James Wright is like a man's man. But he has these incredibly tender moments, right? Blessing, he pulls off the side of the road, he looks at these horses, and he has this intimate moment with the horses. And I think that's, James Wright is a man's man, which is awesome, but he's still sort of man enough in a way to reach out and have these tender moments. And he's able to show sympathy and empathy in ways like this. The William Stafford poem is sort of similar. That's a really complicated poem because he sees that the deer's been hit, he's got to move it off the side of the road, not just for his own convenience, but because it's actually dangerous. If someone else sees it and swerves, they could go off into the ravine. But then he realizes that the deer is pregnant, and that complicates matters. But there's this empathy, right? And there's this tenderness that the poem is told with. And that's one reason why I gave you some of these poems. I talked about the Donald Hall poems because they're sort of rural. I imagine we've got some guys in the poem or in the class that are probably, like resistant to this idea of poetry or whatever, as I sort of was at the beginning. But you can have these are not, effeminate men. These are like, do I have that photograph? There's this fantastic photograph of James Wright and Robert Bly at Bly's Ranch in Minnesota. And they're just like cruising around riding horses, and they look like, two cowboys. So we have, I'm going off on a tangent. I realize that. I should probably stop the video and redo it, but I'm not going to. Because I think it's important, because it's one thing that I got out of my experience with poetry is, kind of identity politics, which we'll get to a little bit later. But, you can be a man's man and still be able to have tender moments. And any of you who are fathers have probably realized that. Any fathers I've had in my own classes, you have these macho guys, and they turn in these Comp 1 essays where they talk about their kids, and they're the sweetest guys ever. And that's what's sort of happening in these poems. They're encountering these others. And the others they're not just like, James Wright isn't writing about his kids, right? He's not being tender about these kids. He's being tender about, when we talk about the other, these are others. Judas, an executed murderer, all these sorts of people. Horses are sort of, they're treated as equals almost. There's the horse sort of is a means of transcendence there. I love this poem, Hook. Oh my God. First you got the image of the hook placing the coins in the guy's hand, which is like the Bates sweater, an image that just has never left me since I read it. But James, the speaker in the poem encountering this other, who is another human being, but among human beings is probably an other inside that group because of the hook, right? For better or worse, he's probably looked at it a little bit differently. And so he has this exchange with the guy with the hook. And the way that he embraces, he tends to embrace the other, right? He has these tender moments, which I think is really fantastic. To a blossoming pear tree is sort of the same way. The guy who basically solicits him, right? And he's able to empathize with that. He doesn't go along with the guy, but he understands, the difficulty that this guy is in. Young tree, unburdened by anything but your beautiful natural blossoms and dew, the dark blood in my body drags me down with my brother. And I think that sums up all of the poems that I gave you, I think, is that James Wright sees the other as a brother, right? And that word other is in brother, okay? So the other is separate, but it's also partly the same. So I know I'm sort of going off on tangents, but I really want you to think about how other people are portrayed, and this sort of mature tenderness and empathy that comes across in some of these poems. Some of that changes a little bit so Adrienne Rich, she's got these, they can be sort of, how do I say that? They're very vivid poems. Some of the if you read them, there's, the language, the images can be sort of disturbing at times. But she's also empathizing with people, right? Because, I don't like to think of people, as poets as activist poets, because I think the moment you try to be an activist poet, you stop being a poet and you start being something else. But her poems deal with sort of minorities and other sort of the oppressed, right? And the poems in a way sort of stand up for them. And so she's demonstrating her own empathy, even though the poems themselves are tough poems, and that you have to confront these poems in a way that you don't have to so much confront some of the James Wright or Donald Hall poems. because in some ways they're abrasive, but in their abrasiveness, they're showing empathy for the other, right? Which is something that's kind of interesting. And then the Anna Sweer poems I find really interesting. Lots of poems about relationships. So, a relationship is basically built around the self and the other, right? Man, husband, wife, whatever kind of relationship you're in, doesn't really matter. You have the self and the other, okay? And so the next video is going to be talking about one specific poem where Anna Sweer confronts the other. She's maybe not as empathetic, which is maybe understandable given her situation. One of the discussion thread questions is, I didn't give you any biography of these poets, but if you find any of the poets interesting, you can Google them or try to find out a little bit about their lives and their circumstances, the context of their lives. Whitman was a nurse in the Civil War. Does that explain what's going on in his poetry? Maybe you can find out things about these people's lives, but the next video is going to talk about Anna Sweer and the poem As I Need Air and how she confronts the other in her relationship.